Hello, everybody, and welcome back to part 3 of the Legacy of the Holocaust series, with basically my interview with George Greenwald, my grandfather. I hope you guys have been enjoying the series so far, and in this episode, we're going to be discussing some more of what happened after he, his aunt, and his cousin, and his mother all went to these people's houses who were running a sort of an underground railroad-esque sort of operation, trying to move people from away from areas of the country where they were well known and where they would be potentially spotted and turned over to the Hungarian gendarmerie or the SS. I hope you guys enjoy, but before we get started, George wanted to say a few words.
Well, no, let me just, as you said, let me reiterate that we found that this person's house. He and a friend were the ones that were running people across the border, and they had made arrangements to do this. We stayed in that house for overnight in his basement, in this one man's basement, and waited for some other people that were going to show up. Ultimately, 13 of us were there, squeezed into his little room in his basement, and we waited until the following evening when we were going to set out for the border to try to get across from Hungary to Czechoslovakia. Now, what Miles was referring to is that when you hear me speaking of the activities that were going on in that time, you'll most often hear me refer to the Germans or the Hungarians. And in the more modern versions of history books, that is sometime, I'd say maybe 30 years ago, the word Nazi came into use wherever the word German had been used previously. One of the things that has happened is that since Germany is now a good friend of the United States, and is in fact a country that is currently welcoming people from other countries, in spite of some problems that have been occurring in the last few days. There was a very, very excellent PhD thesis done by a fellow by the name of Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, and I have his book here. Let me hold that up, just hopefully that will show up pretty well. It's called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And in the subtitle, it talks about ordinary Germans and the Holocaust. Now, what Daniel talks about in here is the fact that it was not just the Nazi Party by any means, but Germans, by and large, really were against the Jews, and they participated in a great many of the atrocities that went on in those years. Today, we have to look at that in a different perspective, because we're dealing not today with the grandchildren, and in some cases the great-grandchildren of those people. So in no way am I trying to put blame on the Germans currently, but at that time it was Germans in general who were the persecutors, as were Hungarians, Italians, and some of the other countries that were uh, allied with Germany.
It was a popular ideal at the time.
Oh yes, very much so. And today, of course, other people are being persecuted, not by the Germans, but uh, they're the ones that are being persecuted in places like Syria.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, just keep that in mind a little bit. That I speak of the Germans and not necessarily the Nazis, although there were plenty of Nazis and there were plenty of SS, and we'll probably get into some discussion about that. So, in any case, back to our attempt to get across the border.
Oh, before you get into that real quick, for those of you who wanted to check out Hitler's Willing Executioners, there is a link down in the video description that'll take you to the Amazon store. I highly suggest if you're going to get this book, fair warning, this is not easy reading. This is a thesis, so it's minimum several hundred pages of hard reading. Also, the hardbacks are nearly $1,000 a piece. However, if you want to get it for paperback, you can get it for under $15 on Amazon. So, again, link in the video description. If you're determined to get a paperback and you want to drop $1,000 on a book like that, good on you for having that much money available to you. But if you're going to get it, I highly suggest you get it in paperback.
Well, yeah, he did the book was published in 1996, 20 years ago. And so today, I'm sure that they're not printing the hardback anymore.
Yeah. So, anyways, you were saying.
But it's very interesting. So, okay, back to the basement, and we're all 13 of us are now gathered in this basement. You'll notice that while I know that the Germans were the ones that were the ones that were after us. Many times, most of the time, in fact, you'll find that I'm not referring to specific dates, and it's because I was a very young child at that time. I was only 7 years old, and at some point here, hopefully, I will make some pictures available of what I looked like at that time, pictures of me and my mother. The second evening, at about 8 o'clock in the evening, we set out from Košice, walking across fields, trying to avoid roads where there might be German or Hungarian trucks and cars and people who would spot us. So anyway, we were going across or plowed fields rather, and trying to get to the river where there was a bridge that crossed into Slovakia. When we arrived, it was approximately 11 o'clock at night. We two young children, my cousin and I, were quite sleepy. And we all, 13 of us, plus the two guards, sat down at the bank of the river. The question obviously comes up of, well, how did we think that we were going to get across this river? The two guides had arrangements with the guards on both sides, both the Hungarian and the Slovak guards. The money was in very short supply, so they would accept bribes. There were 13 of us now on the second night in the basement. and the two men began to lead us toward the river, where there is a bridge, or at least at that time there was a wooden bridge that went across the river. And these two guides had an arrangement with the guards on both sides of the river. Money was in very great demand because everything was so terribly, terribly expensive that very few people had any money. And so the guards were willing to accept bribes from, just about anybody to let them across the border. And these two men had an arrangement, and they had been doing this for some time. It took us quite a while to walk across the fields. We stayed away from the roads and went through farmers' fields that were plowed and some that were not, and we had to walk through plants. Little kids, 2 little boys, and 11 adults, plus the 2 guides. And so when we got to the river, we sat down at the bank of the river while the 2 guides went to negotiate with the guards to let us across. This is about 11 o'clock at night. We had started out when it got dark at about 8:30, 9 o'clock, somewhere in that time, and got to the river by 11, sat down there and waited. A few minutes later, the 2 guides came back and said, well, we have a problem because for some reason, both sets of guards, both on our side, meaning the Hungarian side, and the Slovak side, are different than the ones that we've made arrangements with, and the ones who have let us give them money to let us across. So now we're all trying to figure out what to do. We're fortunately hidden well in bushes along the river, but didn't dare to try to cross this wooden bridge, the bridge being a little over 100 yards across. So the guards now are trying to figure out what they're going to do to get us across there. And they're feeling rather desperate, as all of us were feeling rather desperate, because we thought, well, perhaps there would be no way to get across. Just at about midnight, we heard a noise on the bridge. There were a group of people from the Slovak side with blankets draped over their heads, running across the bridge in our direction, coming toward Hungary. Well, this seems kind of silly. Why would we be going towards Slovakia and they going toward Hungary? The answer, of course, is that they, like we, were just trying to get away from areas where they were well known and hopefully hide from the Germans, Hungarians, and even some of the Slovak army that were trying to pick them up to send them to concentration camps. They simply ran across the bridge, and the guards from both sides immediately followed them. They ran after them. No shots were fired, but they were all carrying guns and running after these approximately 8 people that were running toward us. At that point, our two guides said, okay, if there's any chance of us getting across, now's the time to do it. So we all got up from the riverbank, and just as the eight were running toward us, as soon as the guards, were out of the way, we then ran across the bridge in the other direction, going towards Slovakia. And got across safely. Nobody came after us, for as far as we knew. And we had the guides, that is, had set up a place for us in a farmhouse approximately a mile away from the bridge, where we were to be hidden. When we got to that farmhouse, the farmer said, well, you told me that there were only going to be 5 or 6 people, and here you've got a group of 13. We can't possibly keep all of these people here. First, we don't have the space, and secondly, it's just too dangerous for us to take that kind of a risk of trying to hide that many people escaping from the Hungarian side. So the decision was made that 5 of the 13 would stay at that house. 5 of the adults stayed there, and the rest of us went on. These 2 guides knew of another house, still another mile or 2 farther on, where they were fairly certain that the farmer there would be willing to help us. I should mention that unlike in the United States, where there are villages with, or rather there are farmhouses scattered all around, with farms right in the vicinity of the houses. In Czechoslovakia, in this part of the country, people were gathered in villages, and the fields were surrounded the village. So it was a matter of going from one small village to another to try to find somebody who would take us and hide us for the night. Fortunately, the guides were right. There was another farmer who was willing to put us in his basement. The 8 of us that did not stay at the first house, and we went down into his basement, and which was full of not full, but had a lot of potato sacks down there. They were growing potatoes at this time, and so we slept on the potato sacks, waiting for morning, and waiting actually for the following night, because we didn't dare try to show ourselves in the daytime. At about 3 in the morning, the guides came back and told us that, unknown to us, under the bridge, there were some German soldiers who were, there was some dry land under the bridge. Not all of it was covering the river. And there were some German soldiers who were just down there smoking, perhaps taking a break. We don't know what they were doing down there. But they saw and heard us run across the bridge. They immediately followed the whole group and found the first house took the 5 people who stayed there as prisoners, and we never heard from them again. As far as we know, they were probably taken to some concentration camp by the Germans. However, the soldiers knew by the sound of the people running across that there were some children involved, and they couldn't find the children. So they set out now to look for the rest of the group, but never did find us. So we were very lucky in being able to stay there until the following night, when we could then again try to move on to another village and keep on going farther north into Slovakia. The farmer was good enough to feed us, since he had all these potatoes. Our main meal there was boiled potatoes and some hard-boiled eggs, and that's what we ate until the following evening.
It would be far worse in terms of a diet.
Oh, well, it was very welcome because we had nothing to eat until then. So we then set off again for another village, heading north, and again they knew of another farmer who would possibly put us up and hide us. In this case, we were in a hayloft for the evening and the day, and that farmer also fed us some, I think, some boiled potatoes and buttermilk. And ever since, I've loved buttermilk. Again, after the second night, we stayed there until dark the following day, and so we made one more trip toward heading north, and wound up staying in a brewery fairly well into Czechoslovakia. I would say probably about 10 miles inland from the border of Hungary. At the brewery, apparently those people who were in that group had made some arrangements to be picked up by somebody. My mother had a distant cousin in Prešov, which is the next city north of Košice, in what's now the Slovak Republic. And he picked us up in a car. In some way, he actually got himself a government job, and even though he was part of the Slovak army, he was able to get a car and take us to hide out somewhere in a house in Prešov. So it took us 3 days actually to cross the border and get safely into Slovakia. At that house, my mother and her cousin discovered that the maid that they had working for them was a woman who was not married, or perhaps was, but her husband was not there with her. And she had a little boy just about my age. Um, and my mother offered her some money to buy her papers. At first, she was unwilling to sell them because she was worried about what would happen if somebody caught up to them or wanted to see their papers. But ultimately, money went out and she sold us the papers. We then had to take on an assumed name, and I had to memorize a slightly different birth date. Unfortunately, I don't have the papers any longer, and so I don't know either the name or the exact birth date that instead of September 29th, I was supposedly born about a month different from that, with a slightly different first name. From that point on, we made our way by truck and by railroads that were running to a small village called Garadzek. Looking on the map of Slovakia these days, that village, which was really very, very small, is now part of a much larger complex. But my grandparents also were coming to that village, and my mother's sister, her youngest sister, who had stayed in country in Slovakia, and her 8-week-old baby, all four of them came to this same village, and we got this farmer and his wife to put us up. Now, the reason that we knew about this village is that her younger sister, whose name is Illy, had her husband was an engineer, and he had gotten a job to work at an airport near that village. And they were trying to recondition the airport so that the Slovak Air Force could use it if necessary. So there actually were my grandparents, my mother, my mother's sister, the baby, and her husband. So all of us now stayed in the single bedroom that was in this farmhouse. The farmer and his wife, who were approximately in their, I think the man was about 60 years old, about the age of my grandfather, and the farmer's wife, who was just a little bit younger. They moved into the kitchen where they set up a bed, and they slept there while we occupied the bedroom. This went on for several weeks. I know that we were there at least until the end of September, because I had turned 8 by that time. But having stayed there for about 3 months or 4 months, we got worried that from the information that was coming to us, that the Germans were somehow moving into this area of Czechoslovakia, and that we were in danger of being discovered there by the Germans and perhaps captured. In order to try to minimize the risk, the first thing that happened was that my grandparents, my aunt, my mother's youngest sister, and the baby, the 4 of them, we moved to another village nearby. Nearby meaning perhaps 3 miles away. It was sort of up a hill, and these villages, as I mentioned earlier, were quite small. They had perhaps anywhere from 10 to 30 houses in them. So they found a farmer who, again, was willing to hide them, and for money, he was willing to take the risk that they wouldn't be discovered.
Uh-huh.
By now, it was getting to be again fairly cold, and sometime in October, and at about this time, my uncle, that is my wife. Okay, this is Illy's husband.
Uh-huh.
His brother and brother's wife also came to the village. Well, the problem we now faced was that even though 4 people had moved away, now we have the 2 brothers and the wife of one, of the older brother, and his name was Geza, and his wife, her name was Ella. And the question was what to do with them. They had no papers. We fortunately had some false papers so that if ever stopped by Germans or by anyone else, we could show the false papers and in that way pretend to be related to these farmers.
Uh-huh.
The story that was concocted was that my mother's husband was in the Slovak army, and that while he was off in the army, that we were staying with his parents. But what to do with these 3 people? Well, the decision was made to put them up in the hayloft that they had on the farm.
Uh-huh.
They took a mattress, just a single bed mattress, set it about 3 feet off the floor of the hayloft, and covered that all with hay. The 3 of them then hid under the mattress and stayed there for 3 months. Once a day, the farmer's wife, their name was Makoni, she would go up the ladder and take some food to them, and they would have a pail that they would go into for which she either carried down, or there was a vent that she could pour their waste into the same pool where they were collecting the urine and the feces from the animals that they had.
Uh-huh.
So all this time, they're trying to keep them safe in this particular place. Now, things got more and more. We got more and more information, I should say, that the Germans were definitely going to be moving into this area of Slovakia.
Uh-huh.
And they were actually retreating from Russia. So they were coming from the east into the eastern part of Slovakia. And this is somewhat north and west of Prešov. I don't know the exact distance, but probably 10 miles away. In any case, my mother decided that it would not be safe for us to stay in the house, even though we had papers, that we would be better off trying to find some other place where the German soldiers were not prevalent. And so we set out on a 2-week trip. It took us 2 weeks, that is. We didn't know that it was going to take that long, but it was now late in October, and by that time there's a lot of snow that falls in this part of the country, or in this part of the world, and the only way to get around was to walk, occasionally get a ride on somebody's wagon or their sled, their large sled being pulled by horses. I think on one occasion we actually managed to go a couple miles on a truck. But as I said, we went for quite a long time, and periodically would stop somewhere and try to buy food, or did buy food, from farmers along the way. At about 10 days out, a car stopped and asked us if we would like to get a ride. There weren't many cars in that area, but there were some. And we were forced to follow the roads because we had no other way of knowing exactly where we were going.
Yeah.
The destination was to try to go toward the border of the Czech, what was now the Czech Republic, but trying to go north and west. The person that stopped turned out to be a priest, and he picked us up, took us to his house, fed us a very good meal, poured us lots of hot tea and with lots of rum to try to warm us up because it was very, very cold. At this point, it probably would be worthwhile pointing out how we were able to exist in the village that we left. And the reason is that I had not mentioned the fact that the house that we were staying in was practically next door to a church. This was a Protestant village. A lot of the people in Czechoslovakia were Catholics, but in the eastern part, there were a lot of the Protestant religions. It was the only church in this village. The priest had a couple of children, one about my age, one a little older. And from them, I learned to speak Slovak. I didn't know a word of Slovak when we got there, but within about a month, I was speaking rather fluent Slovak. And the minister told his congregation, which were all of the people that lived in the village, to please be quiet and not tell anyone that we were hiding out in this village, that we were Jews.
In other words, keep your mouth shut.
Keep your mouth shut, exactly. And again, one of the very, very fortunate things that happened to us was that these 30 or 40 houses full of people, none of whom were Jewish, did respect his request and never let on to anyone that we were Jewish. But in any case, back now to the priest that has picked us up. He took us to his house, as I said. He fed us. He put us up for the night, and he said, "I would love to keep you here, but I'm just in a small house. I have no place where I can hide you, and unfortunately, there's no place I can take you that I know of that is safe." So at that point, we set out again on foot and continued our walk and our sort of trek toward the western part of Slovakia. We ultimately reached a spot where there were lots of other people also trying to do pretty much what we were doing. That is, hiding out in a forest environment where there was a fair-sized field, I'd say perhaps the equivalent of a football field that we think of, or a soccer field these days, surrounded by woods. And no sooner had we gotten there than it started to rain. So even though it was winter and there was snow on the ground, now we're getting heavy rain. And a few of the people were clever enough to set up some lean-tos, and we were invited to share the shelter with them. And so we stayed there for 3 to 5 days. But food was very short. There was some food that was being brought to us by local farmers. When I say that there were many people there, I mean, we're talking about something on the order of 50 people. Not all of them were Jews. Some were deserters from the Slovak army. The Slovaks did not want to be part of the German collaborators, and so whenever possible, they would desert the army and hopefully try to get back to their home ground without being discovered and without probably being shot if they were caught.
Yeah.
But after several days of this rain, this very heavy rain that we were getting, and fewer and fewer people were coming out to give us food, we decided that while this was perhaps a pretty good idea, we didn't know whether it was safe to stay there. And as more and more of the Slovak deserters came there, they brought with them news that the Germans were also following them into this same area. So here we had left one place where we thought the Germans would be occupying and wound up in a place where we had no shelter, very little food, and decided that the only thing we could possibly do is to go back to Garensek. Mm-hmm. So after spending a fair amount of time there, as I say, and a fair amount of time going there, we set off to go back to Garensek. At this point, I think this would be a good place to break off again, and because a lot happens from this point on, and I would suggest that perhaps this gives us a point where I can then describe again some continuing sagas of where we would come close to being captured.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, if we had stayed in that field, probably within 3 days, it would have been overrun by Germans. So the staying there was not really an option. So let me continue with that next time, and we'll talk about what we found when we got back to Garasek, and how we survived there until the end of the war.
Alrighty. Well, there you guys have it. That's going to be the end of part 3. I really hope you guys have been enjoying this so far. I've heard this part of the story a couple of times, but even then, it's still superbly interesting. On my end, at least, just to hear it reiterated. Hopefully we can keep this going as consistently as I hope we can. And I hope you guys enjoyed as well. So without further ado, I'll see you guys in the next one.